June 4, 1942, 10:20 in the morning. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, watching his greatest mistake unfold in real time. American dive bombers are screaming down from 14,000 feet. In the next 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers will become burning wrecks. 300 of Japan's best pilots will be dead or dying, and Nagumo will realize that his indecision has just lost Japan the Pacific War. But how did it come to this? How did the most powerful naval strike force in the world get caught so completely off guard? To understand this catastrophe, we need to go back 6 months. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The same Kido Butai under Nagumo's command had struck with devastating precision. 6 carriers, 353 aircraft, 8 American battleships, sunk or damaged. It was the most successful carrier operation in naval history. Nagumo returned to Tokyo as a hero. The man who had crippled the American Pacific Fleet in a single morning. For the next 5 months, Nagumo's carriers rampaged across the Pacific unchallenged. They supported the invasion of Wake Island. They hit Darwin, Australia. They raided into the Indian Ocean, sinking British ships. The Kido Butai seemed invincible. Japanese naval aviation was the finest in the world. Pilots with thousands of hours of experience. Superior aircraft like the Zero fighter. Doctrine developed through years of intensive training, but success bred overconfidence. Japanese military planners began to believe their own propaganda about American weakness and Japanese superiority. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, planned an operation to draw out and destroy what remained of the American Pacific Fleet. The target would be Midway Atoll, a tiny coral island 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Yamamoto's plan was complex, perhaps too complex. He divided his forces across multiple task groups, scattered over hundreds of miles of ocean. Nagumo would command the carrier strike force with 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These would attack Midway's defenses, then deal with American carriers when they appeared. Meanwhile, an invasion force would land troops to capture the atoll. Yamamoto himself would follow with the main battleship fleet, ready to deliver the decisive blow once the Americans were drawn out. What Yamamoto and Nagumo didn't know was that American intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station HYPO in Hawaii had been reading encrypted Japanese messages for weeks. They knew Midway was the target. They knew the approximate date of the attack. They knew the Japanese order of battle. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, positioned his 3 available carriers northeast of Midway in a position to ambush Nagumo's force, Enterprise, Hornet and Yorktown. The Americans had the priceless advantage of surprise. Nagumo believed he was hunting the Americans. In reality, he was sailing into an ambush. On the morning of June 4, Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway Island at 4:30. 108 aircraft, bombers and fighters, headed toward the atoll. Nagumo kept 108 more in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against American ships if they appeared. This was standard doctrine. Maintain a reserve ready to strike enemy carriers. At 7 in the morning, Midway's defenses detected the incoming Japanese strike. American fighters scrambled to intercept, but were hopelessly outmatched. The obsolete F-2A Buffalo fighters were slaughtered by Japanese Zeros. 14 of 26 were shot down. The Japanese bombers hit Midway's installations, causing significant damage, but the strike leader radioed back to Nagumo with troubling news. A second strike would be necessary to fully suppress Midway's defenses. This was Nagumo's first critical decision point. He had 108 aircraft below decks, armed with ship-killing weapons, torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs designed to penetrate carrier decks. But if Midway needed another strike, those planes should be rearmed with high-explosive bombs, effective against land targets. At 7:15, Nagumo gave the order, rearm the reserve aircraft for a second Midway strike. Deck crews immediately began the complex, dangerous process, bringing aircraft up from the hangars, removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with land attack munitions. This took time. Torpedoes had to be carefully detached and lowered back into the magazines. New bombs had to be brought up and attached to mounting points. At 7:28, everything changed. A Japanese reconnaissance aircraft radioed a report. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Enemy ships. Nagumo's worst fear confirmed. But were they carriers? The scouts' report hadn't mentioned carriers. Just surface ships, which could mean cruisers, destroyers, anything. Nagumo needed more information. At 7:47, he radioed back. Ascertain ship types and maintain contact. But he had a terrible problem. His reserve aircraft were in the middle of being rearmed for the Midway strike. Torpedoes were sitting on the hangar deck, disconnected from planes. Land attack bombs were being mounted. His aircraft were configured wrong for attacking ships, and reconfiguring them again would take at least another hour. Here's the question. Put yourself in Nagumo's position for a moment. You've just received a vague report of enemy ships. You don't know if they're carriers. Your planes are in the middle of rearming. Your first strike force will be returning soon, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. What do you do? At 7:45, Nagumo made his second critical decision, the one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He reversed his previous order. Stop rearming for the Midway strike. Put the torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs back on. Prepare for a naval engagement. Chaos erupted on the hangar decks of all 4 carriers. Exhausted crews who had been removing torpedoes now had to reinstall them. Land attack bombs that had just been mounted had to come off and be replaced with ship-killing weapons. Officers screamed orders. Men rushed back and forth carrying heavy ordnance. Safety protocols were ignored in the frantic rush. Bombs and torpedoes that should have been properly stored in armored magazines were left sitting on the hangar decks to save time. The 4 Japanese carriers were floating ammunition dumps, their most vulnerable spaces crammed with high explosives. At 8:20, Nagumo's first strike force returned from Midway. 108 aircraft, low on fuel, some damaged. They needed to land immediately, but Nagumo couldn't launch his reserve strike force until the Midway strike was recovered. There wasn't enough deck space. Every carrier deck had to be kept clear for incoming aircraft. At 8:30, Nagumo began recovering aircraft. For the next hour, his carriers were completely vulnerable. Their decks were occupied with landing operations. The reserve strike force sat below in the hangars, armed and fueled, but unable to launch. Fighter cover had to be kept minimal, because Zeros were needed on deck to land. Nagumo still didn't know exactly what American forces he faced. The reconnaissance reports remained frustratingly vague. Finally, at 8:20, the scout radioed. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier, singular. Nagumo assumed he faced 1 American carrier with its escorts. His 4 carriers against 1 American carrier seemed like acceptable odds, even excellent odds. He didn't know that 3 American carriers were converging on his position. By 9:18, all aircraft from the Midway strike had been recovered. Now Nagumo could prepare to launch his reserve force against the American carrier, but the aircraft still needed final arming and fueling. Nagumo ordered his 4 carriers to turn into the wind to prepare for launch operations. The launch was scheduled for 10:30. He never got the chance. Starting at 9:30, American attacks began. But these initial attacks were disasters that accidentally saved the American cause. Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet found the Japanese fleet first. 15 obsolete TBD, Devastator torpedo bombers, slow and poorly armed, attacked without fighter escort. Japanese Zeros slaughtered them. All 15 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. 29 of 30 crew members died, including Squadron Commander John Waldron. Then came Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise. 14 more Devastators attacking at wavetop height. The Zeros dove down from altitude and tore them apart. 10 of 14 were destroyed. No hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked next. 12 Devastators. The Zeros were waiting. 7 were shot down. Again, no hits. Of 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked that morning, only 6 survived. The torpedo attacks accomplished nothing tactically. Not a single hit was scored. It seemed like a complete Japanese victory. Nagumo's staff must have felt relief. The Americans were brave, but their equipment was obsolete, and their tactics were suicidal. But those doomed torpedo attacks had done something crucial. They had drawn all of Nagumo's fighter cover down to sea level. Every Zero fighter was at low altitude, chasing and killing torpedo bombers. The sky above the Japanese fleet was empty. At 10:20, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky's dive bombers from Enterprise reached Nagumo's fleet. 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers at 14,000 feet altitude. McClusky could see all 4 Japanese carriers below, completely vulnerable. Their decks were crowded with aircraft being prepared for launch. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks. Ordnance crews were making final weapons checks, and there were no Japanese fighters at altitude to intercept. McClusky split his formation. He would take Enterprise's VS-6 squadron against Kaga. VB-6 would hit Akagi. At 10:22, the dive bombers rolled over and screamed down at nearly 300 miles per hour. On Akagi's bridge, Nagumo heard the lookout scream. Enemy dive bombers. He looked up to see American aircraft dropping nearly vertically through scattered clouds. There was no time to maneuver. No time to launch fighters. No time to do anything except watch. The first bomb missed Akagi. The second hit squarely on the midship elevator. The 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar. The hangar was packed with fully fueled and armed aircraft, with additional bombs and torpedoes scattered around from the frantic rearming chaos. The explosion touched off a catastrophic chain reaction. Fuel from ruptured aircraft tanks ignited. Bombs detonated. Torpedoes exploded. Within seconds, Akagi's hangar was an inferno, generating temperatures hot enough to melt steel. A second bomb hit aft, near the flight deck, starting more fires. A third bomb struck near the port side, blowing a huge hole in the deck. Kaga, just a few thousand yards away, fared even worse. At least 4 bombs struck her almost simultaneously. One penetrated near the forward elevator and exploded in the hangar among armed and fueled aircraft. Another hit aft. Massive explosions ripped through Kaga's hull. Fire spread so fast that crew members were trapped before they could reach firefighting equipment. Within minutes, Kaga was burning out of control. At virtually the same moment, dive bombers from Yorktown hit Soryu. 3 bombs struck in rapid succession. One hit devastated the forward hangar. Another hit amidships. The third destroyed the aft section. Like her sister ships, Soryu's hangar was full of armed aircraft and loose ordnance. The bombs triggered massive secondary explosions. Soryu's captain gave the order to abandon ship within 20 minutes of being hit. In 5 minutes, from 10:22 to 10:27, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been mortally wounded. It was the most devastating 5 minutes in naval warfare history. Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, surrounded by fire and smoke, and realized what he had done. His indecision had killed the fleet. If he had committed to either the Midway strike or the naval strike and stuck with that decision, his aircraft would have been launched and his carriers' decks would have been clear. Instead, he had wavered. He had ordered rearming, then reversed the order, then delayed for reconnaissance information, then delayed again to recover the Midway strike force. His carriers had been caught in the worst possible state. Fully armed and fueled aircraft crowded below decks. Ordnance scattered everywhere from the chaotic rearming operations. No fighters at altitude for defense, and decks too crowded to maneuver or launch. His hesitation had created perfect conditions for catastrophe. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was some distance from the other 3 and escaped the initial attack. Hiryu's captain immediately launched a counterattack against the American carrier Yorktown, scoring hits that would eventually sink her. But Hiryu was found by American dive bombers later that afternoon and suffered the same fate as her sisters. Bomb penetrating into hangars full of armed aircraft, massive explosions, uncontrollable fires. By evening on June 4th, all 4 of Nagumo's carriers were sinking or sunk. Akagi burned through the night before being scuttled by Japanese destroyers on June 5th. Kaga sank that evening. Soryu went down around 7 p.m. on June 4th. Hiryu was scuttled on June 5th after burning all night. With the carriers went approximately 300 of Japan's most experienced naval aviators. These weren't just pilots. They were the core of Japanese naval aviation expertise. Many had thousands of flight hours. Some had been flying since the early 1930s. They had combat experience from China, Pearl Harbor, and the rampage across the Pacific. They were instructors who trained new pilots. Losing them was catastrophic because Japan's training pipeline couldn't replace them. Japan's naval aviation training program was rigorous but slow. It took 4 years to produce a fully qualified carrier pilot. The program emphasized quality over quantity. Only the very best candidates were selected, and washout rates were high. This had worked well in peacetime, creating an elite cadre of superb pilots. But in war it meant losses were irreplaceable. America's training program was the opposite. Mass production of pilots with acceptable quality. American flight schools were graduating thousands of pilots per year by 1942. They might not be as skilled initially as Japanese pilots, but there were vastly more of them, and they gained experience quickly in combat. Nagumo survived Midway and was evacuated from the burning Akagi. He returned to Japan in disgrace. The public wasn't told the truth about Midway. Official propaganda minimized the defeat. But within the Navy, everyone knew Nagumo had commanded Japan's premier striking force and had lost it through indecision. He would receive other commands, but never again would he lead the Kido Butai. He was given land-based commands in the Solomon Islands and later in the Marianas. On July 6, 1944, during the American invasion of Saipan, Nagumo committed suicide. He shot himself in the head rather than be captured. Some historians suggest he never forgave himself for Midway, that the decision to reverse his arming orders haunted him for the remaining 2 years of his life. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned the Midway operation, received the news while his battleship fleet was still hundreds of miles away. He had remained too far back, confident that Nagumo would handle the American carriers, and he would arrive for the decisive battleship engagement. When he learned that all 4 carriers were lost, he immediately cancelled the invasion and ordered a general retreat. Without carrier air cover, his battleships were vulnerable to American air attack. The operation had been a complete failure. The strategic consequences of Midway became clear over the following months. Japan had lost half its fleet carrier strength in a single day. The remaining carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, couldn't project power alone. Japan's carrier construction program was too slow to replace the losses quickly. America, meanwhile, had massive carrier construction underway. The Essex-class carriers were already being built, fast modern ships that would arrive in 1943. The pilot loss was even more devastating strategically. Those 300 dead aviators represented an irreplaceable investment in training and experience. Japan never recovered the qualitative edge its naval aviation had possessed in 1941 and 1942. By 1944, American pilots were meeting Japanese pilots who had only a few months of training. The aerial turkey shoots of 1944 resulted from the pilot quality gap that began at Midway. Midway reversed the strategic balance in the Pacific. Before June 4, 1942, Japan was advancing and America was retreating. After June 4, 1942, America began the long counteroffensive that would end in Tokyo Bay in September 1945. The first American offensive, the Guadalcanal Campaign, began just 2 months after Midway in August 1942. It would have been impossible if Japan still possessed 6 fleet carriers and 600 elite pilots. Nagumo's fatal mistake was tactical, but it had strategic consequences that determined the war's outcome. His indecision in those critical hours on the morning of June 4 created the conditions for disaster, changing his mind about rearming his aircraft, waiting for reconnaissance information, delaying to recover the Midway strike force. 5 minutes of American dive bombers destroyed what Japan had spent 2 decades building. Military historians still debate whether Nagumo could have avoided the disaster. Some argue he made reasonable decisions based on available information, and was simply unlucky that American dive bombers arrived at the precise moment when his carriers were most vulnerable. Others argue his indecisiveness was the core problem, that a more aggressive commander would have launched immediately against the American ships regardless of whether they included carriers. But Nagumo himself knew the truth. Standing on Akagi's burning bridge at 10:25 on June 4, 1942, watching Kaga and Soryu explode in the distance, he knew his hesitation had destroyed Japan's carrier fleet. His fatal mistake in those critical hours had lost Japan the war. The Pacific conflict would continue for 3 more years. But the outcome was determined in those 5 minutes when American bombs found Japanese carriers crowded with armed aircraft and littered with loose ordnance, the direct result of Nagumo's indecision about how to arm his strike force. Japan's naval aviation never recovered. America's industrial superiority, which Yamamoto had feared and which Nagumo had underestimated, would produce dozens of new carriers and thousands of new aircraft. But on June 4, 1942, at 10:25 in the morning, Nagumo didn't need to think about abstract industrial capacity. He simply watched his 4 carriers burn and knew his fatal mistake had just changed history.